Walk through any European city today, and you'll pass beneath doorways so tall they seem absurd. Stand at the base of ancient columns that dwarf modern humans. Climb staircases whose proportions feel slightly wrong, as if designed for someone else. We've been told these architectural choices represent artistic ambition, a desire for grandeur and permanence. But what if the truth is far simpler and far more disturbing? What if these buildings feel wrong because they weren't built for us at all? The evidence has been hiding in plain sight for centuries, preserved not in dusty archives or secret chambers, but on the walls of museums and in the streets we walk every day. Before photography existed, before the age of digital manipulation, artists served as the documentary filmmakers of their era. They recorded what they saw with obsessive accuracy, particularly in 18th century Italy, where realism wasn't just a style, but a discipline. These masters didn't paint fantasies, they painted life, exactly as it appeared before them, and what they captured should force us to question everything we think we know about human history. Look closely at the cityscapes from this period, at the bustling piazzas and crowded streets. Pay attention not to the buildings, but to the people, and you'll notice something that historians desperately want you to ignore. In these scenes, human beings of radically different sizes coexist in the same space. This isn't a perspective error or artistic license. We're seeing adults of normal height walking alongside figures who tower above them by a factor of 2 or even 3. The taller individuals aren't depicted as monsters or mythological beings. They are shown as ordinary members of society, distinguished primarily by their expensive clothing and confident bearing. What's most striking is how mundane these paintings make the scene appear. There's no drama, no conflict, no suggestion that anything unusual is happening. The giants and the normal-sized humans occupy the same streets, enter the same buildings, participate in the same social rituals. But look more carefully at the social dynamics. The larger figures consistently wear the garments of nobility and aristocracy. They carry themselves with authority. The smaller humans surrounding them are dressed more modestly, often depicted in service roles or as common tradespeople. This wasn't artistic symbolism. The Italian masters of this era built their reputations on faithful representation of reality. They documented the wealth and power of their cities with photographic precision. Would they have collectively decided to insert impossible fantasy elements into works meant to celebrate civic grandeur? The far more logical conclusion is that they painted what they saw every single day. A world where humans of our current size lived in the shadow of a physically superior ruling class. Once you accept this possibility, even tentatively, the next question becomes unavoidable. If these beings existed, where did they live? The answer is all around us, embedded in the very architecture that frames our cities. Look at any building constructed in what we call the classical style. The proportions are wrong for human beings of average height. Door frames rise 5 or 6 meters high, tall enough for a giraffe to walk through comfortably. Window openings stretch upward like portals to another floor. Ceilings vault so high that any attempt to heat these spaces with the technology of past centuries would have been futile waste. We're told these design choices represent aesthetic ambition, a desire to inspire awe and convey power through scale. But this explanation collapses when examined from a practical standpoint. A 6-meter door isn't just expensive to build, it's expensive to maintain, difficult to secure, and impossible to keep warm in winter. The sheer weight of such a door makes it cumbersome for a normal human to open and close. Why would any civilization deliberately choose such impracticality unless the dimensions weren't impractical at all? Think about your own home. The doorways are roughly 2 meters high because that's what human ergonomics require. Someone 175 centimeters tall can pass through comfortably with clearance overhead. A person of 195 centimeters might need to duck slightly. The dimensions aren't arbitrary. They're optimized for the species using the space. Now apply that same logic to buildings where doorways reach 5 or 6 meters. For what size being would such openings be ergonomically appropriate? The mathematics are simple. A creature standing 3 to 4 meters tall would find these proportions perfectly normal, just as we find our 2-meter doorways unremarkable. The same calculation applies to ceiling heights, window placements, and stair proportions in their original form before later modifications. Walk through any preserved palace or cathedral, and you'll feel the dissonance. Modern humans look like children in these spaces, dwarfed by the scale of everything around them. We've grown so accustomed to this mismatch that we don't even notice it anymore. We call these buildings magnificent without asking why they're magnificent on a scale that makes us feel small. But the paintings tell a different story. When you look at 18th century depictions of these same architectural spaces, you see the taller figures fitting naturally into the environment. They are proportional to the columns and archways. They fill the doorways appropriately. They don't look lost in oversized rooms, they look at home. Meanwhile, the humans of standard height appear as servants or visitors in spaces clearly not designed for their comfort. This correlation between the painted evidence and the architectural reality is too consistent to dismiss. From Rome to Paris, from Vienna to St. Petersburg, the same pattern repeats. Monumental buildings that feel slightly wrong when we occupy them, and artistic depictions showing larger humans for whom these spaces were clearly intended. We're living in someone else's infrastructure, adapting buildings that were never meant for us. We install mezzanines to split one giant floor into two manageable levels. We brick up portions of doorways to reduce them to reasonable sizes. We add heating systems that struggle against the impossible volumes of these spaces. We're like children moving into an adult's house, trying to make it work despite the mismatch. Of course, you might argue that paintings alone can't prove something this extraordinary. Fair enough. Let's move beyond artistic interpretation and examine physical evidence that can be measured and verified. Many of these documented buildings still exist today, and they're ready to reveal their secrets through direct comparison. Take a painting from the 1700s showing a specific monument, perhaps a triumphal arch or a cathedral entrance. Note carefully where the human figures stand in relation to the architectural elements. Observe how high their heads reach on columns, how they relate to doorway proportions, where their eye level falls on decorative features. Now visit that same location today and stand in the exact same spot. Take a photograph from the same angle. The difference is shocking and undeniable. In the historical painting, a person standing at the base of a column reaches well up the shaft, their head rising past decorative elements near the bottom. In a modern photograph of the same location, a tourist of average height barely reaches halfway up the column's pedestal. The scale discrepancy is massive and mathematically precise. If we take 175 centimeters as the average height of a modern European and calculate backwards from the proportions shown in the paintings, the figures depicted must have stood between 3 and 3.5 meters tall. This isn't conjecture or artistic interpretation, it's geometry. The same column, the same architectural features, but humans who relate to them completely differently. This pattern repeats across hundreds of documented locations throughout Europe. The doorways that seem absurdly tall to us today were being filled quite naturally by the figures in historical paintings. Windows we strain to look out of were at comfortable eye level for the painted subjects. We're not imagining this discrepancy, we're measuring it. The conclusion is inescapable. Either the artists were collectively lying in a coordinated fashion across different cities and decades, or they were accurately recording a world where humans of vastly different sizes coexisted, with the larger specimens clearly dominating the social and architectural landscape. But here's where skeptics always deploy their favorite counter-argument, and it seems devastating at first. If all these buildings were designed for giants, why are the staircases normal-sized? Surely beings 3 or 4 meters tall would need steps significantly larger than what we find in these structures. It's a valid question, and the answer reveals something even more disturbing about our history. First, consider the possibility of dual-purpose design. The giants represented a ruling elite, while normal-sized humans served as workers and servants. The architecture would need to accommodate both groups. Grand ceremonial doors for the masters, but service stairs suitable for the help. But there is a darker and more likely explanation, one that requires us to examine what lies beneath our feet. Photographs from early 20th century excavations in cities across Europe show the same unsettling pattern. The first floors of ancient buildings are buried deep underground. Streets that once saw foot traffic now lie meters beneath modern pavement, covered by dense layers of mud and compressed earth. Official archaeology calls this the cultural layer, attributing it to centuries of accumulated garbage and debris. But the thickness and composition of these deposits tell a different story. This looks less like gradual accumulation and more like the aftermath of a massive mud flood, a cataclysmic event that buried the lower portions of cities in a single catastrophic episode. In this context, the staircase problem solves itself. What we see today aren't the original entrances and stairs. They're later modifications made after the catastrophe, after the giants disappeared, and normal-sized humans inherited these oversized structures. The survivors dug out new entrances at the new ground level. They rebuilt stairs to suit their own proportions. They subdivided the enormous interior spaces into multiple floors with appropriate ceiling heights. They bricked up portions of giant doorways to create openings they could actually manage. We're not looking at original architecture, we're looking at adaptive reuse. The buildings were conquered by a smaller species that reshaped them to fit new occupants. This also explains another persistent mystery. Many ancient structures show evidence of multiple phases of construction using different techniques and materials. We're told this represents centuries of renovation and modification, but it more likely represents the transition from one civilization to another. The original massive construction by the giants, followed by cruder adaptations by the humans who came after. History was sanitized to remove any mention of this transition. Those who gained power after the catastrophe rewrote the chronicles, transforming giants from a real ruling class into mythological creatures suitable only for fairy tales. But while they could rewrite books, they couldn't unmake millions of tons of stone. The buildings remained as witnesses, though their true purpose was obscured through modification and narrative control. We're told that primitive humans with simple tools somehow built these monuments to inspire awe in future generations. The absurdity of this claim becomes obvious once you start questioning it, but most people never do. Yet, buildings can be modified, and their history obscured through retrofitting. What about objects that can't be changed? There are artifacts in museums and collections worldwide that cannot be explained by the anthropometry of normal-sized humans. These aren't ceremonial or symbolic items. They're practical tools and implements that could only be used by beings significantly larger than us. Consider the ancient folios preserved in libraries and museums. These aren't merely large books. They're massive tomes weighing 40 to 50 kilograms with bindings that stand over a meter tall. The official explanation claims these dimensions served aesthetic purposes or allowed more text per page. But try to imagine actually reading one of these books. A normal-sized human must stand to turn each page, using both hands and significant physical effort. You cannot comfortably read while seated. The font is so large and the page so vast that your field of vision can't encompass the full text at once. For a being 3 to 4 meters tall, however, this same book becomes perfectly proportioned, equivalent to our standard formats today. The font size, the line spacing, the weight distribution, all of it makes sense for hands and eyes positioned at a completely different scale. These weren't showpieces. They were practical volumes designed for regular use by creatures much larger than us. The same logic applies to weapons displayed in museums. Two-handed swords like claymores and Zweihanders often exceed 2 meters in length and weigh so much that only a trained athlete can lift them briefly. Actually, fighting with such a weapon would be suicidal for a normal human. The momentum of a single swing would leave you exposed and exhausted. Historians dismiss these as ceremonial weapons, but many show clear evidence of combat use. Notches from blocking blows, wear patterns from repeated sharpening, damage consistent with actual battle. Who wielded them? A human who would collapse from exhaustion after minutes, or a warrior for whom this represented a standard armament? Look at the proportions of the handles, the weight distribution, the length of the grip. These weapons were ergonomically designed for someone, and that someone wasn't us. Firearms present the same problem. Giant muskets, often called wall guns, have stocks designed for shoulders much broader than any human's. The trigger mechanism is positioned too far back for normal arm length. We're told these required two-person operation, but the design clearly indicates individual use. The stock configuration, the sight alignment, the weight balance, everything points to a single shooter of enormous size. Musical instruments tell the same story. Preserved cellos and double basses from earlier periods require finger spans and arm lengths that challenge even the largest modern musicians. Playing these instruments at their intended range is nearly impossible for a human of standard proportions. Every one of these objects, books, weapons, instruments, represents perfect ergonomic design, but the ergonomics aren't ours. These weren't made for humans of our scale. They're the everyday tools of a different species, giants who handled them as naturally as we handle. Smartphones and coffee cups today. And if the evidence is this strong in Europe, it would be foolish to assume the phenomenon was limited geographically. When we expand our investigation beyond Western architecture and art, we find that giants were a global reality, documented across continents and cultures. Ancient Egypt provides perhaps the most extensive visual record. Temple walls and tomb chambers are covered with detailed reliefs showing the same scene repeated with remarkable consistency. Enormous figures tower over normal-sized humans who barely reach their knees. Egyptology has spent decades selling us a convenient explanation, hierarchical perspective. The theory claims that size in Egyptian art represented social importance, not physical reality. The pharaoh was depicted as a giant because he was godlike. His servants appeared small to emphasize their inferiority. This interpretation requires us to believe that Egyptian artists, who achieved incredible sophistication in anatomy, architecture, and engineering, suddenly abandoned realism when depicting human proportions. It asks us to accept that a culture obsessed with precise mathematical ratios and measurements would arbitrarily distort the most basic element of their visual record. The far simpler explanation is that they drew what they saw. These weren't metaphorical representations of power, they were documentary records of biological difference. The giants weren't symbols, they were the actual ruling class, physically towering over their subjects. Medieval European sculpture tells the same story through a different detail. Look at the statuary adorning Gothic cathedrals, the carved knights and saints on facades and in interior chapels. Pay attention to the animals depicted alongside these figures: war horses, hunting dogs, lions in symbolic compositions. The proportions are jarring. A fierce lion barely reaches the knight's knee, no larger than a house cat. A war horse stands only waist-high to its rider, more pony than steed. Art historians rush to explain this as inability to observe proper proportions or symbolic representation of spiritual dominance over the material world. But these same sculptors carved intricate lace patterns in stone and rendered human emotions with stunning subtlety. They possessed absolute mastery of their craft. Are we really supposed to believe they collectively couldn't judge the size of a horse? The more logical conclusion is that the animals are correctly proportioned, but the humans standing beside them were giants. A lion that reaches a normal man's knee would barely reach the ankle of someone 3.5 meters tall. From Egyptian reliefs to European sculpture, from Asian temple carvings to pre-Columbian monuments, the same evidence repeats. We're told that every culture independently decided to represent their rulers as giants for purely symbolic reasons, abandoning realism only in this one specific aspect of their art. Or we can accept the simpler explanation: they depicted reality, and reality included a race of beings significantly larger than modern humans. The architectural evidence, the artistic documentation, and the physical artifacts all point to the same conclusion. Giants existed. They ruled. They shaped the world we inherited. Which leads to the most important question of all. If they were real, if they were powerful, if they dominated our planet for centuries or millennia, where did they go? What could eliminate a species with such advantages? And did they truly disappear completely? Or do fragments of their existence persist in ways we've been trained not to recognize? Biology is harder to erase than history books. Nature preserves information across generations through genetic code that can lie dormant for centuries before suddenly expressing itself. What we've been taught to consider abnormalities might actually be windows into our true past. Examine photographs from the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and you'll regularly encounter individuals of extraordinary height. Medical science immediately labels them as victims of gigantism or acromegaly, attributing their size to pituitary disorders and hormonal imbalances. But look closely at these people. Many are proportionally built, physically powerful, and show none of the skeletal deformities characteristic of growth hormone disorders. They don't present as sick or disabled. They appear as healthy specimens of unusual size. What if these aren't medical anomalies at all, but genetic throwbacks? What if buried in human DNA are recessive genes inherited from those giants who once ruled our cities? Most of the time, these genes remain dormant, suppressed by the genetic code of the smaller humans who survived whatever catastrophe ended the age of giants. But occasionally, through some combination of inheritance, nature's programming glitches. The ancient genes activate. A child is born carrying the physical template of our predecessors, towering over their normal-sized parents and siblings. We call it a disorder and try to suppress these traits medically, but perhaps we're looking at living proof that the giant civilization didn't vanish without a trace. They mixed with us, their bloodline diluted but not eliminated. Every so-called giant in modern times might be an echo of that ancient race, a genetic memory made flesh. This would explain why these individuals appear across all populations and ethnic groups. The giant genes aren't limited to one region because the giants themselves were global. They ruled from Egypt to Europe to Asia, and when their civilization fell, the survivors interbred with normal-sized humans everywhere. We're all carrying fragments of giant DNA, and occasionally those fragments align in ways that produce someone bearing the stature of their ancient ancestors. But this raises the final question. If giants interbred with normal humans, if their genetic material persists in our population, why don't we see more of them? What happened to shift the balance so dramatically that beings 3 meters tall became rare genetic accidents instead of the ruling norm? The answer must involve catastrophe. Something happened that devastated the giant population specifically, or created conditions where their size became a liability rather than an advantage. Look at the archaeological record, at the buried first floors and mud-choked streets we discussed earlier. This wasn't gradual cultural accumulation. It was a sudden, violent transformation. Cities were buried under meters of mud in what appears to have been a massive flooding event. In such a catastrophe, size becomes a disadvantage. Larger bodies require more food, more resources, more space. When infrastructure collapses and supply chains break down, the giants would have been the first to suffer. They couldn't hide in small spaces, couldn't survive on minimal rations, couldn't adapt to reduced circumstances as easily as their smaller neighbors. Whatever happened, it hit hardest at the top of the social pyramid. The ruling giants, living in their purpose-built palaces and depending on complex support systems, were devastated. The smaller humans, already adapted to making do with less, accustomed to service roles and physical labor, had better survival odds. After the catastrophe, the few surviving giants found themselves outnumbered in a world no longer suited to their needs. They had two choices: die out or interbreed. Most chose the latter. Within a few generations, pure-blooded giants became extinct. Their genetic material diffused through a much larger population of normal-sized humans. What remained were oversized buildings no one could explain, artifacts no one could comfortably use, and artwork depicting a world that no longer made sense. Those who gained power in the post-catastrophe world faced a problem. They inherited cities they couldn't explain, and structures that testified to a previous civilization's superiority. So they did what every new regime does. They rewrote history. The giants became myths, relegated to fairy tales and legends. Their actual existence was erased from official records, transformed into allegory and symbol. The buildings were attributed to the ingenuity of normal-sized humans working with primitive tools, a narrative so absurd it should have been questioned immediately, but propaganda repeated often enough becomes truth. We were taught not to trust our eyes, not to measure the doorways or calculate the proportions. We were given elaborate explanations for why ancient peoples would build on a scale completely impractical for their supposed size. And we accepted it because questioning meant acknowledging something far more disturbing, that we're not the first advanced civilization on this planet, and we're certainly not the most impressive. But now the evidence is undeniable. The paintings show us what the world looked like when giants walked among normal humans. The architecture preserves the scale they required. The artifacts prove they existed by fitting no other possible user. The genetic throwbacks appearing in Cs. Modern populations demonstrate their bloodline persists. We live in buildings designed for someone else. We walk through doorways meant for beings twice our size, and we've been convinced this is normal. We're told our ancestors built these structures through determination and primitive tools, and we believe it despite the obvious impossibility. We accept that every ancient culture independently decided to draw their rulers as giants for purely symbolic reasons. We explain away the physical evidence, the anthropological mysteries, the architectural absurdities, because acknowledging the truth would require rewriting everything we think we know about human history. But the truth is carved in stone, frozen in paint, and encoded in our very genes. Giants existed. They ruled our planet for a period we can no longer accurately date because the chronology itself was falsified. They built the cities we claim as our own. They shaped the world we inherited. And then they disappeared, victims of catastrophe and time, leaving behind only traces we've been trained to ignore or reinterpret. The question isn't whether giants existed. The evidence for that is overwhelming once you're willing to look at it honestly. The real question is why we're so desperate to deny it. What makes this truth so threatening that it must be hidden behind layers of alternative explanations and academic dismissal? Perhaps because accepting giants means accepting that human history is not a linear progression from primitive to advanced. It means acknowledging that civilizations can rise to heights we haven't achieved and then collapse completely. It means admitting we're living in someone else's ruins, smaller successors to a race we've deliberately forgotten. The official narrative requires us to be the pinnacle of evolution, the crown of creation, the most advanced beings to walk this earth. Admitting giants means surrendering that comforting lie. It means recognizing we're not special, just the latest tenants in a world built by better architects. But the stone remembers what the textbooks forgot. The paintings preserve what the chronicles erased. And somewhere in our DNA, the genes of giants wait for their moment to wake up and remind us of our true past. We're not the masters of this planet. We never were. We're the inheritors of a catastrophe, living in the shadow of those who came before, trying desperately to convince ourselves that everything was built for us. Look at the doors, measure the steps, study the paintings, calculate the proportions, and then decide for yourself whether you want to keep believing the comfortable lie or face the disturbing truth. Giants were real, and their world is the one we're still living in today.